You are 2 years old, stacking wooden blocks on the nursery floor. When your mother's head hits the straw, you don't know it yet. But the scream that will wake you up for the next 45 years has already begun to bloom in your chest. The palace maids whisper. The silk is stripped from your bed. Your titles erased with a flick of your father's pen. And your name falls like dust off royal tongues. The same man who once called you my pearl of the world now walks past you in the corridor as though you are nothing but air. Your mother, Boleyn, kneels in a gray gown. The blade rises. You run toward the scaffold. You scream for the guards to stop. You tell them you are their queen. You are Elizabeth. But they do not hear you. They never hear you, and even decades later. When you command armies and rule empires, even when you stand unshaken against kings, you still cannot stop the blade in your dreams. This is not a ghost story. This is a true story of how a little girl, abandoned and disgraced, carved her name into the spine of history with nothing but her mind, her silence, and a crown that weighed more than gold. Elizabeth Tudor, born on the 7th of September, 1533, came into the world wrapped in silk, pearls sewn into her gowns, kissed by a king who promised her a golden life. For the first 2 years, she lived as a princess. Her mother taught her to read by tracing letters into her hand. Her father carried her through gardens. She learned the names of every nobleman before she could count to 10. They said she had her mother's cleverness and her father's fire, but paradise does not last in the Tudor court. Her mother lost a son, and with him, she lost the king's love. On the 2nd of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn kissed Elizabeth goodbye and went to a jousting tournament. She never came back. By the 19th of May, 1536, Elizabeth had become a bastard. The Parliament had removed her from the line of succession. Her royal things were packed away. Her golden cups vanished. Her rooms were given to someone else, and no one told her why. When is Mama coming back, she asked. Day after day. To no reply. But children hear everything. The whispers of adultery, of witchcraft, of betrayal, burned themselves into her skin before she knew what they meant. She learned that her mother had been killed like a traitor, called a whore and a monster. She learned that people looked at her with the same suspicion, the same disgust. And she learned to read the danger behind smiles, to measure the silence of hallways. She never asked for her mother again. She learned to survive instead. Years passed. She was passed from house to house, like an unwanted letter, from Hatfield to Hunsdon to Richmond. Never allowed to stay. Never allowed to root. At age 10, she spoke 4 languages. She slept in a servant's bed. No matter how brightly her mind burned, the stain of her birth followed her. Her half-sister Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, never forgave her for being Anne Boleyn's child. Mary saw Elizabeth as a walking wound. When Mary became queen in 1553, the fire started. She hunted Protestants. And Elizabeth, a symbol of Protestant hope, became her perfect target. She was dragged through Traitor's Gate, the same passage her mother had walked before her death. She was locked in the Tower, in the same cell Anne Boleyn had occupied, the same iron bars, the same window facing the execution ground, and there she waited. No evidence was ever found, but the Tudors did not need evidence to kill their own. For 2 months, she awoke each day, not knowing if it would be her last. She etched words into the stone wall with her ring. Much suspected by me. Nothing proved can be. She learned to bow, to pray in Latin, to pretend loyalty. She lied with grace, begged with humility, and offered Mary everything except her true self. Mary released her. But Elizabeth was never the same. Survival had cost her soul a layer of innocence it would never get back. She became careful. She became brilliant. She became terrifying. When Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth was sitting beneath an oak tree reading Plato in Greek. Riders thundered into the courtyard. "Your Majesty," they called. The bastard girl, the cursed child, became queen. The girl whose mother was called a witch now held the scepter of England, but her coronation did not erase the ghost beside her. Anne Boleyn was dead, but never gone. Her daughter would build a kingdom in her shadow. Elizabeth never married. She trusted no man. She allowed no one to share her throne or her body. She made herself a myth because myths do not bleed. And yet, every night, she bled in her sleep. She built an empire. She destroyed the Spanish Armada. She turned England from a shattered kingdom into a superpower, and still, the dream returned. The same scaffold, the same gray dress, the same scream that no one hears. For 45 years, Elizabeth carried a secret under her coronation ring, a portrait of Anne Boleyn, hidden against her skin, pressed into the bone of her finger until her death. She ruled with brilliance, with cruelty, with impossible endurance. But the crown could never give her back what she lost at 2 years old. Her story is not one of revenge. It is one of survival. It is one of building power on top of ashes and learning that some victories come at the price of sleep, of softness, of ever feeling safe. Elizabeth Tudor became the woman her mother would have dreamed of. But the price was that she could never stop dreaming of her mother. And when she finally died, in March of the year 1603, they say she smiled in her sleep for the first time in years. Her last words, "I did it. Mama. I became the queen you died for." But she had been that queen all along. The sun had barely risen over the walls of the Tower of London when Anne Boleyn stepped into the courtyard. Her grey damask gown, whispering against the straw, laid for her final walk. A hush clung to the air. Not reverent, not solemn, but tense, as if the very stones were afraid of what they were about to witness. Just a few miles away, a little girl with red hair and a crown of gold thread woven into her nursery cap stacked wooden blocks one atop the other. Her eyes wide, with the kind of concentration only a child can possess. She was not told that this would be the last morning she would be called princess. She was not told that her mother had been declared a traitor, or that her father, King Henry VIII, had signed the order for execution, the way another man might sign a receipt for a loaf of bread. But she would feel it. She would feel it for the next 70 years. They would later say that Anne Boleyn died with grace, that she spoke calmly, that she forgave the king and prayed for his soul. But all Elizabeth would remember, or imagine, or dream again and again, was the moment the sword fell and no one listened to her scream. She would relive it, not as the woman she became, but as the child who had no words for death. That morning, the household staff moved quickly. Orders had come down from on high. The princess's apartments were to be emptied, the silks and jewels packed away, her tutors dismissed, her titles revoked. There would be no more Your Grace. From that moment forward, she would be addressed as the Lady Elizabeth, a polite insult wrapped in noble cloth, a child born of a mother disgraced, and a father who had moved on. Elizabeth asked where her cups had gone, why her favorite gown had vanished, why the portraits of her mother had been removed from the halls. No one answered. Not directly. Adults seldom tell the truth to children, thinking the truth will crush them. But Elizabeth was not like other children. She listened when they thought she played. She watched when they thought her distracted. She heard the maids muttering about blood and treason. She noticed the silence, her name brought into a room, and each time she asked when her mother was coming back and no one responded. She learned something irreversible about the world, that power could vanish in a breath, that love could be erased by signature, and that queens, no matter how graceful, could die alone. While the kingdom dressed in gold, the days turned into weeks, and the silence never lifted. Elizabeth stopped asking. She learned, instead, to listen harder, to memorize the faces of those who bowed too low or not at all, to trace patterns in how the courtiers moved around her. The lessons came not from books but from glances, whispers, and closed doors. She began to understand the weight of her last name, and how easily it could become a rope. She was shuffled between households, each one colder than the last, her status always uncertain. One day a nobleman's ward, the next a ghost in a borrowed bed. She read by candlelight, devoured Latin, Greek, French, Italian, devoured every word that might become a shield. If she could not be loved, she would be feared. If she could not be royal in name, she would be royal in mind. By the time she was 10 years old, Elizabeth could recite Seneca and Cicero, write courtly letters in 4 languages, and decipher the moods of a room faster than most men could draw breath. But none of this brought her closer to safety. Her father, Henry VIII, had married again. Jane Seymour had borne him a son, Edward, and the court rejoiced as if Elizabeth had never existed. Yet even that joy would curdle. Jane died soon after, and the king's mourning turned quickly into another marriage. Then another. Then another. Elizabeth watched it all from the periphery, never allowed too close to the fire, but always close enough to feel the heat. When she was finally brought back into the line of succession, thanks to the kindness of Queen Catherine Parr, it was not a restoration, it was a calculation. A daughter legitimized only when the kingdom needed every possible heir. Henry VIII died in January of the year 1547. Elizabeth was 14 years old. Her half-brother Edward, a sickly boy of 9, took the throne, and Elizabeth, now orphaned, found herself under the roof of Queen Catherine and her new husband, Thomas Seymour. For a moment, it seemed she might find peace. But predators wear silk as easily as wolves wear fur. Seymour was charming, handsome, and completely unworthy of trust. He crept into Elizabeth's room at dawn, laughing, tearing her gown, touching what should never be touched. When Catherine found out, she sent Elizabeth away, not to protect the girl, but to preserve her husband's reputation. Once again, Elizabeth learned that even those who claim to love you will abandon you the moment you become inconvenient. She never spoke of it. Not then. Not ever. But her actions afterward spoke volumes. She never let another man near her throne or her body. She never again mistook kindness for safety. And she never forgot. Every betrayal became a lesson. Every humiliation, a blade honed to perfection. She took each wound and stitched it into armor. Years later, when her sister Mary became queen, Elizabeth smiled and bowed and played the game. Mary had suffered too, declared a bastard when her own mother, Catherine of Aragon, was cast aside for Anne Boleyn. The two sisters were mirror images, each the product of a broken marriage, each haunted by the downfall of the other's mother. But Mary carried her pain like a sword, She never forgave Elizabeth for being Anne's child. And when rebellion brewed in the shadows of the court, Mary found the excuse she needed. Elizabeth was arrested, dragged through Traitor's Gate, and locked inside the Tower of London, the same tower where Anne had waited for death. The same windows, the same echoing footsteps, the same stones that had once soaked up her mother's blood now sat cold beneath her feet. She was 20 years old, alone, accused, marked, and each morning, she waited to hear the steps of the guards come to take her to the scaffold. Every sound became a sentence. Every hour, a lifetime. But Elizabeth did not break. She prayed. She smiled. She wrote letters of loyalty. She lied, as only a daughter of Anne Boleyn could lie, with charm, with brilliance, with purpose. And when they finally let her out, she walked from that prison not as a victim, but as someone who understood that survival was the most dangerous power of all. She would wear that lesson like a crown, and when the day came that she sat beneath an oak tree at Hatfield House, and the riders arrived to tell her that Mary was dead and she was now Queen of England, she did not cry. She did not laugh. She merely looked up at the sky and whispered, "This is the Lord's doing." But deep down, the voice of a 2-year-old girl stirred, reaching for a hand that had long turned to dust. The crown was hers. The kingdom was hers. But the mother she had once tried to save in a dream was still gone. And the dream would return, again and again. As the night followed her rise to the throne, in the great halls of Whitehall, Elizabeth Tudor now moved like a ghost, wrapped in velvet. The girl who had once slept beside scullery maids now stepped through palaces hung with gold-threaded tapestries and watched servants fall to their knees as she passed. They called her, "Your Majesty." They bowed so low, their foreheads brushed the marble. But she never let her eyes soften. She never let her step falter, because she knew how quickly a crown could become a noose, how fast reverence could turn to hatred. She had learned that queens were only safe for as long as they were useful, and that daughters of executed women would never be safe at all. She had stood beneath that great oak tree at Hatfield House on the 17th of November, 1558, and accepted the truth that no one else dared say aloud. That power would not protect her. That love could not be trusted. That rule was not a gift, but a sentence. The people cheered for her in the streets, calling her Good Queen Bess, their shouts loud and ecstatic as her coronation procession rolled toward Westminster Abbey. But she noticed how many of those same mouths had once whispered, "Bastard." She noticed which faces had served Mary with equal devotion, who had clapped at Jane Seymour's wedding, who had once refused to look her in the eye when she was only Lady Elizabeth. She remembered all of them, and beneath her coronation ring, hidden where no one could see, was the miniature of a woman with dark eyes and a long neck, a mother she had been ordered to forget, yet carried like a wound. The portrait of Anne Boleyn pressed into her skin with every heartbeat. The court knew nothing of it. They knew only the white gowns, the shining pearls, the clever smiles and calculated words, but inside, Elizabeth remained the girl who had once asked, "Where is my mother?" and received no answer but silence. She surrounded herself with brilliant men, Cecil, Walsingham, Leicester, but gave none of them her full trust. She allowed flirtation, courted marriage offers, but never yielded. A queen could not be both ruler and wife. She knew what happened to queens who loved. She had seen the blood on the scaffold. She had tasted the ash of abandonment. If her own mother, crowned and cherished, and once the center of Henry's world, could be dragged to execution in a matter of weeks, what protection could any woman hope for? No. Elizabeth would be both woman and monarch, but never both at once. She would rule as a virgin, not out of piety, but out of strategy. No man would possess her throne, her body, or her legacy. Still, the nights were long. Even in her greatest triumphs, the defeat of the Spanish Armada in the year 1588, the flowering of English art and exploration, the reverence of poets and the fear of foreign kings, Elizabeth could not outrun the dream. It came, as it always had. The Tower courtyard, the straw, the grey gown, her mother kneeling, the sword rising, Elizabeth running, screaming, "I am your queen, obey me." But the guards did not hear. Her voice was too small, too late, and the blade fell every time. She learned to adapt to its rhythm. She refused to sleep past dawn. She kept dozens of candles burning through the night. She never allowed her chamber to fall into full darkness. Her ladies-in-waiting would tiptoe through the palace halls at 3 a.m. to find their queen trembling in bed, her nightdress soaked with sweat, her crown lying somewhere on the floor where she had knocked it in her sleep. They stopped asking questions. The ones who stayed learned not to comment on the pale look in her eyes, on the circles beneath them. They learned to keep extra candles by her bedside. They learned that silence was the only comfort Elizabeth would allow them to offer. But the silence never meant peace. She once said that she had the heart and stomach of a king, and it was true. No matter how sleepless the night, her days were commanded with iron resolve. She stared down Spanish ambassadors and Scottish rebels. She played French suitors against each other like cards in a gambler's hand. She endured plots and poisoned cups, false pregnancies and whispered betrayals. She executed Mary, Queen of Scots, not as an act of cruelty, but because she knew mercy would be read as weakness. She knew the fate of women who wavered. She had not survived a decade of disgrace and imprisonment, only to fall prey to the softness of conscience. Yet despite all this power, she never once ordered a woman executed on Tower Green. That patch of grass where Anne Boleyn had knelt, where Elizabeth's dream always returned, was quietly marked, respected, avoided. Others died elsewhere, far from that haunted place. The chapel inside the tower was renovated under Elizabeth's orders, a tribute to the souls departed, yet never naming which soul she meant. She banned French executioners from English soil. She refused to discuss Anne Boleyn openly, never proclaimed her innocence, never officially restored her title. But she did not have to. Every act of mercy, every law passed under her reign, every victory claimed in her name, each was a whisper to a mother, "Long gone, I have made your death matter." And the people loved her for it. To them, she was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the mother of the realm. They built statues in her image. They wrote poems to her wisdom, songs to her beauty. They did not see the exhaustion in her bones or the fear behind her clever eyes. They did not know that, for all her brilliance, all her magnificence, Elizabeth never stopped being that small girl with the wooden blocks, listening for footsteps that never brought her mother home. They did not see the hidden portrait beneath the gold, the hand that sometimes trembled while signing death warrants, the letters written to dearest mother that she never dared send. She had gained a kingdom. She had silenced every rival. She had rewritten what it meant to be born illegitimate, what it meant to be a woman in power. She had become not just the ruler of England, but the soul of an era. And yet, in the deepest part of her, there was still a question unanswered. A child's question. Mama, did I do enough? That question would follow her to her final days. Not because she doubted her rule, But because the ache of Anne Boleyn's death was never just political, it was personal. It had been the wound that shaped her, the silence that taught her to listen, the loss that made her capable of ruling, but never of resting. Not truly. And rest, when it came, would be the greatest act of surrender she ever attempted. In the last decade of her reign, Elizabeth Tudor had become legend wrapped in lace, a myth dressed in pearls, a sovereign whose word commanded oceans, whose portrait was hung in every chamber, whose voice could lift nations or break them, yet behind closed doors, the legend aged like any mortal woman. Her skin, once as pale as moonlight, thin to parchment, her auburn hair, once the blazing crown of a warrior queen, became a shadow of its former fire. Hidden beneath elaborate wigs, her teeth blackened, her get stiffened. Her heart, though still fierce, beat under layers of bone-deep fatigue. The court still bowed, still flattered, still composed madrigals in her honor. But in the dead hours of early morning, the truth returned to her like it always had, unrelenting, whispering, cold, the truth that no power had ever silenced. She had never escaped that scaffold. Even the very air in her bedchamber had grown heavy with memory. She kept the same ring on her finger for more than 4 decades, refusing to remove it. Even when her knuckles swelled and her skin cracked beneath the weight of age, that ring, nestled into her flesh, held the secret no one dared ask about aloud, the painted face of Anne Boleyn, smiling faintly from behind a miniature glass. It was not just jewelry. It was ritual. It was grief. It was the echo of a woman who had vanished in the span of a morning, and yet never truly left. Elizabeth could not bear to sleep lying down. Her ladies found her seated upright in her great chair, eyes closed but body tense, as if even in rest she refused to give in, because she knew sleep brought the dream, the Tower courtyard, the gray gown, the sword, her mother's blood on the straw, and her voice, her child's voice, rising like smoke, only to vanish into deaf ears. So she stayed awake, through winter storms and summer heat, through plague scares and assassination threats, through celebrations and state meetings. She remained alert, until her body could no longer hold her mind aloft. Her physicians begged her to rest. Her counselors suggested retreat, but she would not relinquish control. Not to men. Not to time. Not even to the night. She piled pearls onto her gowns, hundreds of them, sewn into her sleeves, her bodices, her hair, her shoes, jewels that glimmered like tears frozen in mid-fall. To the court, it was vanity, but to her, it was memory. Her father had once called her his pearl of the world. Before Anne's fall, before the axe, before he stopped speaking her name. And now, in her final years, she wrapped herself in that name as armor. Outside her chambers, the world continued. Shakespeare's words echoed through crowded theaters. Explorers returned with treasures from the New World. England's trade expanded. The empire grew. But inside the Queen's apartments, there was only quiet. The ticking of clocks, the rustle of silk against wood, and the steady, measured breathing of a woman who had ruled longer than most of her subjects had lived. She spoke less in those final years, laughed less, smiled only in echoes of her former charm. Her favorite courtiers died or drifted away. Robert Dudley, the great maybe of her heart, passed and was buried. Others followed. And Elizabeth, who had once moved among men like fire through dry grass, began to dim. She had spent a lifetime mastering the art of holding a nation in her hand. But she had never learned how to hold herself. Power had been her companion, her defense, her substitute for the warmth she was denied as a child. But as her limbs weakened and her spine curved, she could no longer carry it as effortlessly as she once had. There were days when she would gaze into the hearth fire without blinking, her hands trembling slightly in her lap, as if waiting for someone who would never arrive. And sometimes, she would whisper not to her ladies, not to her ministers, but to the silence itself, small fragments of letters never sent. Mama, they still speak your name with fear. Or, I did it. I kept the crown. I made them kneel. Yet still, it did not feel like victory, because victory would have meant peace. And peace had always been a stranger to her. She had never truly known it. Not as a girl. Not as a queen. And certainly not as a daughter. She had earned the love of her country. But she had done so by sacrificing every trace of personal comfort. No husband. No child. No confession of grief. She could not afford to be soft. Not even for a moment. Not even behind closed doors. Every tear that threatened to fall was swallowed. Every ghost that hovered at the edge of her sight was ignored. Every dream was buried beneath duty. Until, at last, the body began to fail. It was the winter of the year 1602. Turning towards 1603, the queen refused to eat, refused to sleep, refused to allow physicians to touch her. She wandered the halls of Richmond Palace like a sleepwalker. Her once sharp eyes, dulled by shadows, her voice became brittle. Her step, unsure. She spoke little, answered less, but clutched at her ring as if it held back death itself. And when, at last, she collapsed into the chair where she had so often watched the dawn break over her realm, her ladies knew that the final vigil had begun. The court waited in silence. Those who had once feared her power now feared her passing more, for without Elizabeth, there was no one left who could balance the factions, who could hold England steady between religious storm and foreign invasion. But for Elizabeth herself, the end was not political. It was personal. And as her breathing slowed, as her hands slackened, and the ring pressed a final time into her worn flesh, something changed. Her ladies said she smiled, not the ceremonial smile of a queen greeting ambassadors, not the sharp smile of courtly wit, but a soft, unguarded smile, the kind only children have, the kind that remembers something beautiful before the world taught them fear. And though her voice had been quiet for weeks, one of them, Elizabeth Southwell, recorded that she whispered something in that final breath. I did it. Mama. I became the queen you died for. And with that, she was gone. The dream did not come again. For the first time in 45 years, the Tower courtyard was still. The sword did not fall. The guards did not turn away. The child's voice did not go unheard. In death, Elizabeth was finally what she had never been in life, rested, safe, forgiven, and perhaps, just perhaps, in the last flicker of her mind, she saw not the scaffold, but a woman's arms outstretched. Not a crown, but a cradle. Not a legacy, but a lullaby. And after a life spent ruling the waking world, she let herself sleep. After the bells tolled across London, after the muffled drums signaled the end of an era, after the courtiers draped her apartments in black velvet and the ministers signed their trembling names onto new declarations of succession, there was a silence in England that felt heavier than war. Elizabeth was dead. Not the figure they had bowed to. Not the face on the coins. But the woman they had feared and loved and never truly understood. And in that silence, the country mourned not just a monarch, but something more profound, a shield, a symbol, a singular presence that had kept chaos at bay for nearly half a century. She had outlived her enemies, outmaneuvered her rivals, outshone every man who had tried to replace her. But the fire had finally burned out. They laid her to rest in Westminster Abbey, not beside a husband or a child, for she had neither, but beside her sister Mary, the same sister who had once locked her in the tower and come close to taking her life. It was an irony too sharp to be missed. Two women who had warred in silence for decades, now sleeping side by side under stone. Their rivalry reduced to dust, but beneath that irony, buried in the vaults and in the memories of those who served her, something else remained, something the public never saw. Because while England spoke of Gloriana and praised the golden age she had created, a few spoke of the girl behind the throne. The orphan who had spent her entire life pretending she wasn't broken. Even in death, she was wrapped in performance. Her funeral procession stretched for miles, the black banners fluttering above a carriage draped in silver cloth. Trumpets cried out over weeping crowds. Bishops read verses meant to glorify, but none of them mentioned the candles she kept burning through the night. None of them spoke of the sweat-drenched silks, the screams that pierced the silence of her chambers before dawn. None dared utter the name of the woman in the ring, because for all her grandeur, Elizabeth had ruled with a secret stitched beneath every royal seam. Her mother's death was never truly over. And the dream, the Tower courtyard, the running feet, the crown tumbling from her head, had been more real to her than any coronation. When the physicians cut the ring from her finger, they found her secret staring back. Anne Boleyn's portrait, tiny and still bright, after all those years, lay pressed against the inner gold. It had lived there, untouched, for 45 years, through plague and assassination plots, through battles and negotiations, through the rise and fall of countless lords, through victories over Spain and threats from within her own court. The ring had remained. It had embedded itself into her flesh, her bone, her blood. It had marked her not just as a daughter, but as a woman who had refused to forget, even when silence was required, even when memory was dangerous, even when her mother's name was still spoken with fear. Historians now argue over her reign. Was she brilliant or cruel? Cautious or manipulative? A genius of statecraft or a woman imprisoned by her own trauma? But the truth is simpler. Elizabeth ruled like a survivor, because that's what she was. She had survived a mother's execution, a father's abandonment, a stepfather's abuse, a sister's hatred, a kingdom's suspicion. She had lived long enough to see every ghost become a shadow in her own palace. She had lived long enough to bury the last living memory of Anne Boleyn, and long enough to outlast the shame. But there was something else she never said. Though she carried her mother's portrait, she never cleared her mother's name. Not publicly. Not in Parliament. Not with papal declarations or royal decrees. It was a silence that puzzled even her closest advisors. Why? After all this time, would she still let Anne Boleyn remain in the records as a traitor? Why? After winning every battle, would she refuse to rewrite that one piece of history? Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was fear. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, because to clear her mother's name would have required her to acknowledge everything she had buried, every moment of childhood spent listening to the whispers of maids, every shameful title change, every cruel laugh, when someone called her bastard in a whisper, too loud to be innocent. To clear Anne would have been to reopen the wound that had never truly closed. And Elizabeth had spent her whole life learning to bleed without flinching. And so she ruled in silence, but loved in secret. She rebuilt the chapel where her mother had been held, lit candles where no prayers had been spoken in decades. She ensured no woman would ever again kneel on Tower Green. Even as she allowed men to die for less, she carried Anne's face on her hand, even while refusing to speak her name at court. And she died wearing pearls, the very jewel her father had once used to praise her before he erased her. It was as if she had turned every symbol of humiliation into a crown. The bastard child had become the ruler of empires, but in her final hours, stripped of pageantry and pride, she had reached for the portrait in the ring, not for the orb of state, not for the crown, not for the Bible placed on her lap by trembling bishops. No. She had looked at her mother's face, and in doing so, had spoken what no one else had ever heard her say. I did it. Mama. Not, I reigned. Not I won. But I did it. It was not power she had wanted. In the deepest folds of her soul, it was redemption. Not for her country. Not even for her name. But for the little girl who never got to say goodbye. For the child who thought she had failed to save the woman who gave her life. And in that last moment, Elizabeth finally laid down the burden she had carried since May of the year 1536. Not the crown, but the silence. And perhaps that was the greatest triumph of all. The storm outside Richmond Palace passed quietly the night after Elizabeth breathed her last, as if the sky itself had been waiting for her to go before it allowed itself to weep. Courtiers moved softly through the halls like ghosts, their shoes muffled by rushes, their voices lowered to whispers, afraid of disturbing something sacred that lingered in the air. No one laughed. No one dared speak of what came next, for though the crown would pass to James of Scotland, and the Tudor line would end, as the Stuart line began, the weight of Elizabeth's presence remained like fog on the Thames, dense, unshakably, and filled with the echo of dreams that had haunted her since she was a child. They say grief is heaviest when it's unspoken, that a silence carried too long becomes a burden in the blood, passed down from heartbeat to heartbeat, like a second skeleton. And Elizabeth had carried more than her share of silence. She had learned early that to survive, she must never speak of the things that truly mattered. She had never been able to cry for her mother in public, never been allowed to speak of that final kiss, that final absence, Ibn Asquin, with the entire court at her command. She had been gagged by the same rules that had once turned her from a princess into a bastard. A woman could rule, yes, but only if she reigned without emotion, without memory, without grief. Only if she kept her dead hidden behind pearls and ceremony. But memory is a wild thing. It does not obey decrees. It does not yield to silence. It returns when the candles burn low, when the night presses against the windows, when sleep slides its cold hands across your back. And in that place where even queens are vulnerable, Elizabeth had never been free. Not even once, because in the realm of sleep, she was not England's ruler. She was the girl in the Tower courtyard, barefoot and pleading, crown slipping from her hair, as the blade arced through the air once more. That was the truth she could never say aloud, that no matter how many victories she earned, she had always been losing the same battle every single night. She had trusted no one fully, not her counselors, not her friends, not even the men who claimed to love her. She had learned too young that love was a transaction, that loyalty came at a price, that tenderness could turn into betrayal with a signature on a parchment, When Thomas Seymour had slipped into her chamber in the year 1548, when he had cut her dress while laughing, when she had flinched and no one had come to protect her, something in her heart had been sealed off. Not broken, not shattered, just closed quietly and permanently. It was not that she could not love, it was that she could not afford to. And so she built walls. Beautiful walls. Clever walls. Walls made of policy and letters and poetry and statecraft. She played kingdoms against one another. Danced on the edge of war and peace. Spoke 8 languages, like lullabies. She turned her body into myth. Her mind into a weapon. Her reign into theater. And the world called it glory. But inside, the walls were cold. There were no footsteps beside her when she walked the long corridors at night. No laughter over dinner that did not come laced with ambition. No arms waiting in her bed but the echoes of her own restless limbs. And always, the portrait beneath her ring pressing into her skin like a secret that refused to be forgotten. Her life was long, but not wide. It reached across oceans and empires. But within her chest was a narrow corridor. She had never escaped. The hallway that led back to a nursery without silk, to a crownless child, asking why her mother had not returned. Some say she ruled with an iron will, that she was stubborn, proud, vain, and perhaps she was. But iron is forged in fire, and her fire had been grief. Her pride was not arrogance, it was armor. Her vanity was not selfishness, it was the mask of someone who had once been stripped of everything and had sworn never to be diminished again. Every jewel she wore was a wound covered in brightness. Every triumph, a scar turned to gold. But in her final weeks, something shifted. She stopped speaking. She stopped eating. She stood in her chamber for hours without moving. Her eyes fixed on some invisible point in space, as if waiting for someone to walk through a door that had been closed for nearly 70 years. Her ladies whispered of visions, of murmured names, of fingers that moved through the air as if tracing letters never written. And when the physicians begged her to lie down, she shook her head, because to lie down was to close her eyes, and to close her eyes was to return to the tower courtyard, to the scream, to the blade, to the blood. But exhaustion is a tide. No queen can resist forever. When sleep finally took her, it did so, not like a thief, but like a mother, gathering her child into her arms. Her breathing slowed, her hands unclenched, and the ring, embedded deep in the flesh, shimmered faintly, as if glowing from within. Those present said she smiled, that the lines on her face softened, that she looked not like a ruler but like a girl at peace. Perhaps for the first time, it is said that those on the edge of death often see visions, that the mind, in its final moment, reaches for something to soothe the soul, that they see faces long gone, hear voices that once made them feel safe, and perhaps, in that moment, Elizabeth saw her mother again, not kneeling, not weeping, not bleeding, but alive, reaching for her, forgiving her, telling her that she had been enough all along, and maybe, just maybe, that night, the dream changed. No sword, no scaffold, no silence, only a woman with dark eyes and long fingers, whispering to the girl with fire in her hair. "You did it, my daughter. Come home." And Elizabeth, for once, did not run. She walked toward the voice, toward the love she had been denied, toward the peace she had spent a lifetime earning. And the tower courtyard was quiet, after her body was lowered into the tomb, after the last echoes of the funeral procession faded through the abbey's high arches. and the nobles had bowed for the final time, before the marble slab sealed their queen beneath stone. England did not erupt in chaos. There was no uprising, no panic in the streets, no foreign prince charging across the channel. Instead, there was a strange stillness, as if the kingdom itself held its breath for nearly half a century. Every law passed, every war declared, every ship sent out upon a rising tide had carried one signature, one seal, Elizabeth heir. To imagine the world without it felt like waking from a long, fierce dream. And yet, even in death, Elizabeth Tudor remained present. Not in body, not in voice, but in the system she had built, the language she had reshaped, the loyalty she had demanded and received, the pride she had stitched into the very fabric of English identity. People still whispered her name, not out of fear, not out of duty, but out of awe. For she had turned the word bastard into a battle cry, had worn her illegitimacy like a crown. Where others saw shame, she carved a throne, and though her portrait still hung in every hall, eyes fixed and unblinking above fireplaces and council chambers, what lingered more than image was her silence. The long, unspeakable silence surrounding the name Anne Boleyn. No royal decree ever cleared Anne's name. No formal act restored her as queen. The history books continued to mark her death as lawful, her execution as righteous. And yet, that same daughter who had every tool to rewrite it never did. She left it hanging, unfinished. A wound, just barely covered with velvet and varnish. Some say it was fear, that even as queen, she dared not tempt the old ghosts of Henry's court. Others say it was strategy, that her reign depended on ambiguity, on the ability to be both daughter of Anne and not daughter of Anne, both Tudor and outsider, both myth and memory. But perhaps it was something else. Perhaps Elizabeth did not erase her mother's execution because she had never truly accepted it. To rewrite the law would have meant acknowledging the grief, and grief, for Elizabeth, had never been public. It had been kept beneath brocade sleeves, hidden in a ring worn until it bled, locked into unsent letters, penned at candlelit desks. Grief had been a locked door in her soul, guarded by duty, watched over by fear. Her public image had been invincible virgin, untouchable, radiant, but her private self had been one long act of remembering. And in that remembering, there was power, because by not speaking of Anne, Elizabeth ensured that no one else could define her. She allowed no statues, no portraits in court, no anniversaries of her death. Anne Boleyn's name was not lifted up in triumph, nor was it buried in scorn. It was kept just outside reach, like a shadow trailing every triumph. She became a legend inside a legend, a woman erased from stone, but carved into flesh, carried in her daughter's ring, her face pressed against skin and blood for 45 years, and Elizabeth's silence became the loudest declaration of all. The court never understood it. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about the peculiar queen who surrounded herself with male advisors, but never allowed one to rule her. They gossiped about her refusal to marry, her flirtations that never bore fruit, her sudden mood swings, and her impossible pride. But they missed the one truth that her silence guarded most carefully. She had already lost the only relationship that ever mattered. What man, what prince, what child could replace a mother stolen by treason and a father too cold to grieve? She had stood in the ashes of that loss her entire life and built an empire, and the empire remembered her. Years after her death, Sailors still called her name when storms threatened to crack their masts. Mothers still whispered stories of good Queen Bess to their daughters at night. Voices low, as if speaking of someone half divine, poets wrote verses about her justice, her light, her command of men. Historians etched her face into the golden age of England, and artists painted her as Athena, as Gloriana, as the sun itself. But even in the brightest renditions, her eyes never changed. They remained dark, watchful, a little sad, because what the world celebrated as strength, she had lived as sacrifice. What the world mistook for willpower had been survival. What they called majesty had been mourning, folded neatly and worn with discipline. And though she ruled alone, it was never truly alone. For each night, each step, each breath, she carried a second heartbeat in her chest, the heartbeat of a mother lost on a scaffold when she was still too small to understand what final meant. And so Elizabeth never allowed another woman to be executed on Tower Green. That patch of grass remained sacred, quiet. She never spoke of it, never explained, but the message was clear: not again, not like her. Her reign was not just about power. It was a long act of refusal, a refusal to let history repeat itself, even when vengeance would have been easy. Because in the end, she knew the crown she wore had been purchased with blood, and not just the blood of rivals or enemies, but the blood of her own name, her own lineage. She had not forgotten. She had not forgiven. But she had endured. That was her victory. Not the empire. Not the gold. Not the fear in men's eyes or the love of her people. But this, that she had taken the deepest cut history ever gave her, and turned it into a reign that silenced every blade. And somewhere, in a place far from marble tombs and painted ceilings, a child's voice no longer cried out for her mother, because the woman that child became had never stopped listening, and had finally been heard. In the quiet years that followed her death, the world began to shift in ways Elizabeth Tudor would never witness, but somehow had already foreseen. James of Scotland took the throne, and with him came a court of new tongues, new gods, new shadows. The Tudor name so soaked in blood, glory, fear, and fire became a relic, whispered rather than shouted, remembered rather than wielded. But there was one name no one could quite banish, one presence no successor could escape, one legacy that clung to England like perfume to silk: Elizabeth. She had not left a husband to mourn her, no son to claim her crown, no daughter to continue her line. She had left only memory, and memory, once planted, does not die the way people do. It grows wild, rooted in myth and truth alike, fed by grief, lit by fascination. And so she remained, in portrait, in ballads, in plays that cast her as goddess and ghost, warrior and widow, flame and shadow. The girl who had once built towers from wooden blocks in her nursery now became the tower itself, immovable, untouchable, enduring. But beneath the monuments and the marble, beneath the golden frames and royal anniversaries, there was still a story that no one quite knew how to tell. Not the story of the Virgin Queen, not the story of Gloriana, but the quieter one, the story of a daughter. Because even as England evolved, as colonias spread, as language changed and lines of kings came and went, Elizabeth's most sacred truth remained hidden in plain sight. The ring, the silence, the vow that was never spoken, only lived. I will never forget her. Not in life, not in death, not in history, And history did not forget. For every portrait painted in Elizabeth's image stern, proud, radiant, there came another artist who noticed the shadows in her eyes. For every sermon that praised her divinity, there was a whisper that spoke of her loneliness. For every poem that extolled her virginity, there was a line that hinted at the ache of what had been taken from her. Not just lovers or children, but the simplest of things, peace, safety, the right to be loved without condition. She had been watched since the day she was born, praised for walking early, applauded for speaking Latin before most children knew how to pray, but no one had truly seen her. Not when her mother vanished. Not when her father looked through her as if she were made of fog. Not when Seymour laughed and tore her dress. Not when Mary put her in the tower. Not even when the crown was placed upon her head. They loved her. Yes, but only when she was useful. Only when she was perfect. Only when she made them feel safe. And Elizabeth had learned to be what they needed, not what she was. And so the question remains, quietly nestled in the folds of time, did she ever know rest, not the rest of sleep, which she chased and feared in equal measure, night after night, candle after candle, but the deeper rest, the kind of stillness that comes when the soul is no longer gripping itself to stay upright, the kind of peace that comes when the ghosts stop knocking. Did she ever feel that even once? Perhaps. Yes. Not in the court. Not in the council chamber. Not beneath the weight of the orb or the golden canopy of state. But maybe in those final hours, when the chamber was quiet, and her ring had been removed, and her breathing had slowed to something small and steady. Like a child's. Maybe. In that space between worlds, something opened. And through it walked the only figure who had ever truly known her. Not a lord. Not a soldier. Not a scholar. But a woman in gray. Anne. Not the accused. Not the executed. Not the heretic queen, or the scandal that shook a nation, but simply Anne. A mother. A whisper. A warmth. And maybe Elizabeth did not speak. Maybe she only looked. And maybe, after 70 years of silence, Anne reached out and brushed her daughter's cheek and said what no one else had ever dared. You were never a mistake. Not for a moment. Not for a breath. Not even in the darkest hour of May of the year, 1536, when the blade had fallen and the world had turned away. And maybe that was all Elizabeth had ever needed to hear. Not the cheers. Not the titles. Not the reverence of poets or the surrender of kings. Just that. You were never a mistake. And from that moment, the dream stopped. No more running. No more screaming. No more blood in the straw. No more crown tumbling from a child's head. Only quiet. The kind of quiet she had chased her entire life. And in that silence, Elizabeth finally slept. Not as a queen, not as a legend, but as a daughter who had been heard. Time moved forward, as it always does, brushing its fingers over stone and skin alike, softening everything that once burned with heat. The courtiers who had once bent their knees at Elizabeth's command eventually grew old, retired, or were buried in silence. The ring that had bound a mother to her daughter was locked away in the royal collections, passed from monarch to monarch like any other trinket. Never again worn, and never again pressed into flesh until it bled. The tower stood as it always had, silent, unyielding, disinterested in memory, its green grass hiding the ghosts buried beneath. And England, ever hungry, turned toward new conquests, new kings, new names to carve into its history. But still, if you listened closely, if you walked the cobbled halls at dusk, when the shadows grew long, you could hear something that did not belong to James, nor Charles, nor any man who followed. You could hear her, not in speech. For Elizabeth Tudor's words were always chosen, always guarded, but in presence, in the quiet refusal of the wind, in the way Westminster's great bells ring longer when the clouds gather low, in the hush that falls when her portrait is uncovered, and eyes, those dark, steady eyes, meet yours across 4 centuries of dust and forgetting, because some lives are not measured in children or in heirs, nor even in wars or policies. Some lives are measured in silence, endured, in pain survived, in the unwavering decision to remain standing when all the world wishes you gone. Elizabeth had no daughter to mourn her, no son to fight in her name. But she left behind something far more defiant. She left behind the story of a girl who was told from her very beginning that she did not belong and who replied by becoming unforgettable. She had inherited the crown from men who thought her a mistake. She had worn it longer than any of them. She had turned her scars into laws, her shame into power, her grief into strategy. Where her father had raged and remarried and ruptured the church to chase a male heir, Elizabeth had made herself enough. She did not marry. She did not bear children. She did not bend. Her rule was her legacy. Her body belonged to no one. Her mind became the sharpest blade in the realm. And her story, the one written in glances and letters, and long of Lord of Loss, Sleepless Nights, was not about victory over nations. It was about victory over herself. For all her strength, Elizabeth was not without cracks, but she never let them break her. She was tired, yes, and lonely, and sometimes cruel in her precision, distant in her self-preservation, but even in those shadows, she was trying, not to be perfect but to be safe. Not to be loved but to be untouched. Because when you have lost your mother before you could form full memory, when your first lesson in power was that it could destroy the ones you loved, you do not allow yourself softness. You build walls, and then you crown yourself on top of them. Still, the strange thing about history is that time eventually gives breath to what silence once smothered. The things Elizabeth never said began to be said for her. Scholars re-examined Anne Boleyn not as the seductress or the spy, but as a brilliant, ambitious, defiant woman cut down too soon. Writers questioned the lies embedded in the trials, the hurried execution, the king's sudden marriage only days after her death, and slowly, across the centuries, Anne's image shifted. Not fully redeemed, not entirely absolved, but no longer alone, no longer erased. It was Elizabeth who had carried her there, not with proclamations, not with monuments, but with 45 years of unflinching reign, of intelligent governance, of ferocity wrapped in velvet. She had made England fear the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and in doing so, had made it impossible to forget the mother. They say Anne Boleyn died alone, but she did not die forgotten. She lived inside her daughter's choices, in every refused marriage proposal, in every Latin speech that silenced a foreign envoy, in every command given with the calm edge of a woman who had never again begged to be heard. And in the end, it was not Henry's line that endured, not Edward's, not Mary's. It was Elizabeth's, not through blood but through will, through the story, through the idea that a woman born into scandal, molded by loss, shaped by silence, could rise to hold a kingdom and hold it better than any man who had come before her. That is why she endures, not because she ruled, but because she survived, and somewhere, even now, in the hush before dawn, in the flicker of candlelight on old stone, A little girl with flame-colored hair still runs through the courtyard of a dream, calling out for someone who never came. But this time, the blade does not fall. This time, she is heard. This time, a hand reaches back, and the silence is finally answered.